Chapter 4, Notional and Real Assent. I have said that our apprehension of a proposition varies in strength, and that it is stronger when it is concerned with a proposition expressive to us of things than when concerned with a proposition expressive of notions. And I have given this reason for it, viz. That when what is concrete exerts a force and makes an impression on the mind which nothing abstract can rival. That is, I have urged that because the object is more powerful, therefore so is the apprehension of it. I do not think it unfair, reasoning thus, to take the apprehension for its object. The mind is ever stimulated in proportion to the cause stimulating it. Sights, for instance, sway us, as scents do not, whether this be owing to a greater power in them in the thing seen, or to a greater receptivity and expansiveness in the sense of seeing, is a superfluous question. The strong object would make the apprehension strong. Our sense of seeing is able to open to its object, as our sense of smell cannot open to its own. Its objects are able to awaken the mind, take possession of it, inspire it, act through it, with an energy and variousness which is not found in the case of sense and their apprehension. Since we cannot draw the line between the object and the act, I am at liberty to say, as I have said, that as is the thing apprehended, so is the apprehension, and so in like manner as regards apprehension of mental objects, if an image derived from experience or information is stronger than an abstraction, conception, or conclusion, if I am more arrested by our Lord's bearing before Pilate and Herod than by the justum et tenacem, etc., of the poet, more arrested by his voice saying to us, "Give to him that asketh thee," than by the best arguments of the economist against indiscriminate almsgiving. It does not matter for my present purpose whether the objects give strength to the apprehension, or the apprehension gives large admittance into the mind to the object. It is in human nature to be more affected by the concrete than by the abstract. It may be the reverse with other beings. The apprehension then may be as fairly said to possess the force which acts upon us as the object apprehended. Real apprehension then may be pronounced stronger than notional, because things which are its objects are confessedly more impressive and effective than notions, which are the objects of notional. Experiences and their images strike and occupy the mind, as abstractions and their combinations do not. Next, passing on to assent, I observe that it is this variation in the mind's apprehension of an object to which it assents, and not any incompleteness in the assent itself, that leads us to speak of strong and weak assents, as if assent itself admitted of degrees. In either mode of apprehension, be it real or notional, the assent preserves its essential characteristic of being unconditional. The assent of a Stoic to justum et tenacem, etc., may be as genuine an assent as absolute and entire, as little admitting of degree or variation, as distinct from an act of inference, as the assent of a Christian to the history of our Lord's Passion in the Gospel. However characteristic as it is of assent, to be thus in its nature simply one and indivisible, and thereby essentially different from inference, which is ever varying in strength, never quite at the same pitch in any two of its acts, still it is at the same time true that it may be difficult, in fact, by external tokens to distinguish given acts of assent from given acts of inference. Thus, whereas no one could possibly confuse the real assent of a Christian to the fact of our Lord's crucifixion with a notional acceptance of it as a point of history on the part of a philosophical heathen, so removed from each other toto caelo, are the respective modes of apprehending it in the two cases. though in both the assent is in its nature one and the same. Nevertheless, it would be easy to mistake the Stoics' notional assent, genuine though it might be, to the moral nobleness of the just man struggling in the storms of fate, for a mere act of inference resulting from the principles of his stoical profession, or again for an assent merely to the inferential necessity of the nobleness of that struggle. Nothing indeed is more common than to praise men for their consistency to their principles, whatever those principles are, that is, to praise them on an inference without thereby implying any assent to the principles themselves. The cause of this resemblance between acts so distinct is obvious. Resemblance exists only in cases of notional assents. When the assent is given to notions, then indeed it is possible to hesitate in deciding whether it is assent or inference, whether the mind is merely without doubt or whether it is actually certain. And the reason is this: notional assent seems like inference, because the apprehension which accompanies the acts of inference is notional also, because inference is engaged for the most part on notional propositions, both premise and conclusion. This point which I have implied throughout I here distinctly record, and shall enlarge upon hereafter. Only propositions about individuals are not notional, and these are seldom the matter of inference. Thus did the Stoic infer the fact of our Lord's death instead of assenting to it. That proposition as inferred would have been as much an abstraction to him as the justum, etc. Nay, further, the justus et tenax was at least a notion in his mind, but Jesus Christ would in the schools of Athens or of Rome have stood for less, for an unknown being, the X or Y of a formula, except then, in some of the cases of singular conclusions, inferences are employed on notions, unless I say they are employed on mere symbols, or indeed when they are symbolical. Then are they clearest and most cogent, as I shall hereafter show. The next clearest are such as carry out the necessary results of previous classifications, and therefore may be called definitions or conclusions as we please. For instance, having divided beings into their classes, the definition of man is inevitable. We may call it then the normal state of inference to apprehend propositions as notions, and we may call it the normal state of assent to apprehend propositions as things. If notional apprehension is most congenial to inference, real apprehension will be the most natural concomitant on assent. An act of inference includes in its object the dependence of its thesis upon its premises, that is, upon a relation which is an abstraction, but an act of assent rests wholly on the thesis that is as its object, and the reality of the thesis is almost a condition of its unconditionality. I am led on to make one remark more, and it shall be my last. An act of assent, it seems, is the most perfect and highest of its kind, when it is exercised on propositions which are apprehended as experiences and images, that is, which stand for things, and on the other hand, an act of inference is the most perfect and highest of its kind, when it is exercised upon propositions which are apprehended as notions, that is, which are creations of the mind. An act of inference indeed may be made with either of these modes of apprehension, so may an act of assent. But when inferences are exercised on things, they tend to be conjectures or presentiments without logical force, and when assents are exercised on notions, they tend to be mere assertions without any personal hold on them on the part of those who make them. If this be so, the paradox is true, that when inference is clearest, assent may be least forcible, and when assent is most intense, inference may be least distinct. For though acts of assent require previous acts of inference, They require them, not as adequate causes, but as sine qua non conditions, and while the apprehension strengthens assent, inference often weakens the apprehension. Notional assents. I shall consider assent made to propositions which express abstractions or notions under 5 heads, which I shall call profession, credence, opinion, presumption, and speculation. Number 1. Profession. There are assents so feeble and superficial as to be little more than assertions. I class them all together under the head of profession. Such are the assents made upon habit, without reflection, as when a man calls himself a Tory or a Liberal, as having been brought up as such, or again, when he adopts as a matter of course the literary or other fashions of the day, admiring the poems or the novels or the music, or the personages or the costume or the wines, or the manners which happen to be popular, or are patronized in the higher circles. Such again are the assents of men of wavering, restless minds, who take up and then abandon beliefs so readily, so suddenly, as to make it appear that they had no view, as it is called, on the matter they professed, and did not know to what they assented or why. Then, again, when men say they have no doubt of a thing, this is a case in which it is difficult to determine whether they assent to it, infer it, or consider it highly probable. There are many cases, indeed, in which it is impossible to discriminate between assent, inference, and assertion, on account of the oitiose, passive, inchoate character of the act in question. If I say that tomorrow will be fine, what does this enunciation mean? Perhaps it means that it ought to be fine, if the glass tells truly. Then it is the inference of a probability. Perhaps it means no more than a surmise, because it is a fine day today. It is fine today, or has been so for the past week, and perhaps it is a compliance with the word of another, in which case it is sometimes a real assent, sometimes a polite assertion or a wish. Many a disciple of a philosophical school who talks fluently does but assert, when he seems to assent to the dicta of his master, little as he may be aware of it. Nor is he secured against this self-deception by knowing the arguments on which those dicta rest, for he may learn the arguments by heart, as a careless schoolboy gets up his Euclid. This practice of asserting simply on authority, with the pretense and without the reality of assent, is what is meant by formalism. To say, I do not understand a proposition, but I accept it on authority, is not formalism, but faith. It is not a direct assent to the proposition, but still it is an assent to the authority which enunciates it. But what I here speak of is professing to understand without understanding. It is thus that political and religious watchwords are created. First one man of name, and then another adopts them, till their use becomes popular, and then everyone professes them, because everyone else does. Such words are liberality, progress, light, civilization. Such are justification by faith only, vital religion, private judgment, the Bible and nothing but the Bible. Such again are rationalism, Gallicanism, Jesuitism, ultramontanism, all of which, in the mouths of conscientious thinkers, have a definite meaning, but are used by the multitude as war cries, nicknames, shibboleths, and scarcely enough of the scantiest grammatical apprehension of them to allow of their being considered in truth more than assertions. Thus instances occur now and then, when in consequence of the urgency of some fashionable superstition or popular delusion, some eminent scientific authority is provoked to come forward and to set the world right by his ipse dixit. And he indeed himself knows very well what he is about. He has a right to speak, and his reasonings and conclusions are sufficient not only for his own but for general assent, and it may be are as simply true and impregnable as they are authoritative, but an intelligent hold on the matter in dispute, such as he himself has, cannot be expected in the case of men in general. They, nevertheless, one and all, repeat and retail his arguments, as suddenly as if they had not to study them, as hardly as if they had understood them, changing round and becoming as strong antagonists of the error which their master had exposed, as if they had never been its advocates. If their word is to be taken, it is not simply his authority that moves them, which would be sensible enough and suitable in them, both apprehension and assent being, in that case, grounded on the maxim, cuique in arte sua credendum, but so far forth as they disown this motive, and claim to judge in a scientific question of the worth of arguments which require some real knowledge, they are little better, not of course, in a very serious matter, than pretenders and formalists. Not only authority, but inference also may impose on us assents which in themselves are little better than assertions, and which, so far as they are assents, can only be notional assents, as being assents not to the propositions inferred, but to the truth of those propositions. For instance, it can be proved by irrefragable calculations that the stars are not less than billions of miles distant from the earth, and the process of calculation upon which such statements are made is not so difficult as to require authority to set our acceptance of both it and of them. Yet who can say that he has any real and any notional apprehension of a billion or a trillion? We can indeed have some notion of it if we analyze it into its factors, if we compare it with other numbers, or if we illustrate it by analogies or by its implications. But I am speaking of the vast number in itself. We cannot assent to a proposition of which it is the predicate. We can but assent to the truth of it. This leads me to the question whether belief in a mystery can be more than an assertion. I consider it can be an assent, and my reasons for saying so are as follows. A mystery is a proposition conveying incompatible notions, or is it a statement of the inconceivable? Now, we can assent to propositions, and a mystery is a proposition, provided we can apprehend them. Therefore, we can assent to a mystery, for unless we in some sense apprehended it, we should not recognize it to be a mystery, that is, a statement uniting incompatible notions. The same act, then, which enables us to discern that the words of the proposition express a mystery, capacitates us for assenting to it. Words which make nonsense do not make a mystery. No one would call Wharton's line, "Revolving swans proclaim the welkin near," an inconceivable assertion. It is equally plain that the assent which we give to mysteries as such is notional assent, for by the supposition it is assent to propositions which we cannot conceive, whereas if we had had experience of them, we should be able to conceive them, and without experience, assent is not real. But the question follows, can processes of inference end in a mystery? That is, not only in what is incomprehensible, that the stars are billions of miles from each other, but in what is inconceivable, in the coexistence of seeming incompatibilities. For how, it may be asked, can reason carry out notions into their contradictories, since all the developments of a truth must, from the nature of the case, be consistent both with it and with each other? I answer, certainly processes of inference, however accurate, can end in mystery, and I solve the objection to such a doctrine thus. Our notion of a thing may be only partially faithful to the original. It may be in excess of the thing, or it may represent it incompletely, and in consequence it may serve for it, and it may stand for it. only to a certain point in certain cases, but no further. After that point is reached, the notion and the thing part company, and then the notion, if still used as the representative of the thing, will work out conclusions not consistent with itself, but with the thing to which it no longer corresponds. This is seen most familiarly in the use of metaphors. Thus, in an Oxford satire, which deservedly made a sensation in its day, it is said that vice from its hardness takes a polish too. Whence we might argue that whereas Caliban was vicious, he was therefore polished, but politeness and Caliban are incompatible notions. Or again, when someone said, perhaps Dr. Johnson, that a certain writer, say Hume, was a clear thinker, he may answer, all shallows are clear. But supposing Hume to be in fact both clear and a deep thinker, yet supposing clearness and depth are incompatible in their literal sense, which the objection seems to imply, and still in their full literal sense, were to be ascribed to Hume, then our reasoning about his intellect has ended in the mystery. Deep Hume is shallow, whereas the contradiction lies not in the reasoning, but in the fancying that inadequate notions can be taken as the exact representations of things. Hence, in science, we sometimes use a definition or a formula not as exact, but as being sufficient for a purpose, for working out certain conclusions, for a practical approximation, the error being small till a certain point is reached. That is what in theological investigations I should call an economy. A like contrast between notions and the things which they represent is the principle of suspense by curiosity in those enigmatic sayings which were frequent in the early stage of human society. In them the problem proposed to the acuteness of the hearers is to find some real thing which may unite in itself certain conflicting notions which in the question are attributed to it. Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. Or what creature is that which in the morning goes on 4 legs, at noon on 2, and on 3 in the evening? The answer, which names the thing, interprets and thereby limits the notions under which it has been represented. Let us take an example in algebra. In calculus, its calculus is commonly used to investigate not only the relations of quantity generally, but geometrical facts in particular. Now it is at once too wide and too narrow for such a purpose, fitting onto the doctrine of lines and angles with a bad fit, as the coat of a short and a stout man might serve the needs of one who is tall and slim. Certainly it works well for geometrical purposes up to a certain point, as when it enables us to dispense with the cumbrous method of proof in questions of ratio and proportion, which is adopted in the 5th book of Euclid. But what are we to make of the 4th power of A when it is to be translated into geometrical language? If from this algebraical expression we determine that space admitted of 4 dimensions, we should be enunciating a mystery, because we should be applying to space a notion which belongs to quantity. In this case, algebra is in excess of geometrical truth. Now let us take an instance in which it falls short of geometry. What is the meaning of the square root of -a? Here the mystery is on the side of algebra, and in accordance with the principle which I am illustrating, it has sometimes been considered as an abortive effort to express what is really beyond the capacity of algebraical notation, the direction and position of lines in the 3rd dimension of space, as well as their length upon a plane. When the calculus is urged on by the inevitable course of the working to do what it cannot do, it stops short, as if in resistance, and protests by an absurdity. Our notions of things are never simply commensurate with the things themselves. They are aspects of some, more or less exact, and sometimes a mistake ab initio. Take an instance from arithmetic. We are accustomed to subject all that exists to numeration, but to be correct, we are bound first to reduce to some level of possible comparison the things which we wish to number. We must be able to say not only that they are 10, 20, or 100, but so many definite some things. For instance, we could not without extravagance throw together Napoleon's brain, ambition, hand, soul, smile, height, and age at Marengo, and say that there were 7 of them, though there are 7 words. Nor will it even be enough to content ourselves with what may be called a negative level, viz., that these 7 are non-existing or a departed 7. Unless numeration is to issue in nonsense, it must be conducted on conditions. This being the case, there are, for what we know, collections of beings to whom the notion of number cannot be attached except characteristically, because taken individually, no positive point of real agreement can be found between them by which to call them. If indeed we can denote them by a plural noun, then we can measure that plurality. But if they agree in nothing, they cannot agree in bearing a common name, and to say that they amount to 1,000 these or those is not to number them, but to count up a certain number of names or words which we have written down. Thus the angels have been considered by divines to have each of them a species to himself, and we may fancy each of them so absolutely sui similis as to be like nothing else, so that it would be as untrue to speak of 1,000 angels as of 1,000 Hannibals or Ciceros. It will be said, indeed, that all beings but one at least will come under the notion of creatures and are dependent upon that one. But that is true of the brain, smile, and height of Napoleon, which no one would call 3 creatures. But if all this be so, much more does it apply to our speculations concerning the Supreme Being, whom it may be unmeaning not only to number with other beings, but to subject it to number in regard to his own intrinsic characteristics. That is, to apply arithmetical notions to him may be as unphilosophical as it is profane. May be as unphilosophical as it is profane. Though he is at once Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the word Trinity belongs to those notions of him which are forced on us by the necessity of our finite conceptions. The real and immutable distinction which exists between person and person, implying in itself no infringement of his real and numerical unity. And if it be asked how, if we cannot properly speak of him as 3, we can speak of him as 1, I reply that he is not 1 in the way in which created things are severally units. For 1, as applied to ourselves, is used in contrast to 2, or 3, and a whole series of numbers. But of the Supreme Being, it is safer to use the word monad than unit, for he has not even such relation to his creatures as to allow, philosophically speaking, of our contrasting him with them. Coming back to the main subject, which I have illustrated at the risk of digression, I observe that an alleged fact is not therefore impossible because it is inconceivable, for the incompatible notions, in which consists its inconceivableness, need not each of them really belong to it, in that fullness which would involve their being incompatible with each other. It is true indeed that I deny the possibility of 2 straight lines enclosing a space on the ground of it being inconceivable, but I do so because a straight line is a notion and nothing more, and not a thing to which I may have attached a notion more or less unfaithful. I have defined a straight line in my own way, at my own pleasure. The question is not one of facts at all, but of the consistency which each other of definitions and their logical consequences, but of the consistency with each other and of definitions and their logical consequences. Space is not infinite, for nothing but the Creator is such. Starting from this thesis as a logical information, as a theological information to be assumed as a fact, though not one of experience, we arrive at once at an insoluble mystery. For if space be not infinite, it is finite, and finite space is a contradiction in notions, space as such implying the absence of boundaries. Here again, it is our notion that carries us beyond the fact, and in opposition to it, showing that from the first, what we apprehend of space does not in all respects correspond to the thing, of which indeed we have no image. This then is another instance in which the juxtaposition of notions by the logical faculty lands us in what are commonly called mysteries. Notions are but aspects of things, and free deductions from one of these aspects necessarily contradict the free deductions from another. After proceeding in our investigations a certain way, suddenly a blank or a maze presents itself before the mental vision, as when the eye is confused by the varied slides of a telescope. Thus we believe in the infinitude of the divine attributes, but we can have no experience of infinitude as a fact. The word stands for a definition or a notion. Hence, when we try how to reconcile in the moral world the fullness of mercy with exactitude and sanity and justice, or to explain that the physical tokens of creative skill need not suggest any want of creative power, we feel we are not masters of our subject. We apprehend sufficiently to be able to assent to these theological truths as mysteries. Did we not apprehend them at all, we should be merely asserting, though even then we might convert that assertion into an assent, if we wish to do so, as I've already shown, by making it the subject of a proposition and predicating of it that it is true. Heading number 2, credence. What I mean by giving credence to propositions is pretty much the same as having no doubt about them. It is the sort of assent which we give to those opinions and professed facts which are ever presenting themselves to us without any effort of ours, and which we commonly take for granted, thereby obtaining a broad foundation of thought for ourselves and a medium of intercourse between ourselves and others. This form of notional assent comprises a great variety of subject matters, and is, as I have applied, of an obtuse and passive character, accepting whatever comes to hand, from whatever quarter, warranted or not, so that it convey nothing on the face of it to its own advantage. From the time that we begin to observe, think, and reason, to the final failure of our powers, we are ever acquiring fresh informations by means of our senses, and still more from others and from books. The friends or strangers who we fall in with in the course of the day, the conversations or discussions to which we are parties, the newspaper, the light reading of the season, our recreation, our rambles in the country, our foreign tours, all pour their contributions of intellectual matter into the storehouses of our memory, and though much may be lost, much is retained. These informations, thus received with a spontaneous assent, constitute the furniture of the mind, and make the difference between its civilized condition and its state of nature. They are its education, as far as general knowledge can be so called, And though education is discipline as well as learning, still, unless the mind implicitly welcomes the truths, real or ostensible, which these informations supply, it will gain neither formation nor a stimulus for its activity and progress. Besides, to believe frankly what it is told is in the young an exercise of teachableness and humility. Credence is the means by which in high and low, in the man of the world and in the recluse, our barren nature is overrun and diversified from without with a rich and living clothing. It is by such ungrudging, prompt assents to what is offered to us so lavishly that we become possessed of the principles, doctrines, sentiments, facts, which constitute useful and especially liberal knowledge. These various teachings, shallow though they be, are of a breadth which secures us against those lacunae of knowledge which are apt to befall the professed student and keep us up to the mark in literature, in the arts, in history, and in public matters. They give us, in great measure, our morality, our politics, our social code, our art of life. They supply the elements of public opinion, the watchwords of patriotism, the standards of thought and action. They are our mutual understandings, our channels of sympathy, our means of cooperation, and the bond of our civil union. They become our moral language. We learn them as we learn our mother tongue. They distinguish us from foreigners. They are in each of us, not indeed personal, but national characteristics. This account of them implies that they are received with a notional, not a real assent. They are too manifold to be received in any other way. Even the most practiced and earnest minds must needs be superficial in the greater part of their attainments. They know just enough on all subjects, in literature, history, politics, philosophy, and art, to be able to converse sensibly on them, and to understand those who are really deep in one or other of them. This is what is called, with special oppositeness, a gentleman's knowledge. Special oppositeness, a gentleman's knowledge, as contrasted with that of a professional man, and is neither worthless nor despicable, if used for its proper ends, but it is never more than the furniture of the mind, as I have called it. It never is thoroughly assimilated with it. Yet, of course, there is nothing to hinder those who have even the largest stock of such notions from devoting themselves to one or other of the subjects to which those notions belong, and mastering it with a real apprehension. And then their general knowledge of all subjects may be made variously useful in the direction of that particular study or pursuit which they have selected. I have been speaking of secular knowledge, but religion may be made a subject of notional assent also, and is also especially so made in our own country. Theology, as such, always is notional as being scientific. Religion, as being personal, should be real, but except within a small range of subjects, it commonly is not real in England. As to Catholic populations such as those of medieval Europe, or the Spain of this day, or quasi-Catholic as those of Russia, among them assent to religious objects is real, not notional. To them the Supreme Being, our Lord and Blessed Virgin, the Blessed Virgin, angels and saints, heaven and hell, are as present as if they were subjects of sight, but such a faith does not suit the genius of modern England. There is in the literary world just now an affectation of calling religion a sentiment, and it must be confessed that usually it is nothing more with our own people, educated or rude. Objects are barely necessary to it. I do not say so of old Calvinism or evangelical religion. I do not call the religion of Leighton, Beveridge, Wesley, Thomas Scott, or Cecil a mere sentiment, nor do I so term the high Anglicanism of the present generation. But these are only denominations, parties, schools compared with the national religion of England in its length and breadth. Bible religion is both the recognized title and the best description of English religion. It consists not in rites or creeds, but mainly in having the Bible read in church, in the family, and in private. Now I am far from undervaluing that mere knowledge of Scripture, which is imparted to the population thus promiscuously, at least in England. It has to a certain point made up for great and grievous losses in its Christianity. The reiteration again and again in fixed course in the public service of the words of inspired teachers under both covenants and that in grave majestic English has in matter of fact been to our people a vast benefit. It has attuned their minds to religious thoughts. It has given them a high moral standard. It has served them in associating religion with compositions which, even humanly considered, are among the most sublime and beautiful ever written. Especially it has impressed upon them the series of divine providences in behalf of man, from his creation to his end, and above all the words, deeds, and sacred sufferings of him in whom all the providences of God center. So far, the indiscriminate reading of Scripture has been of service. Still much more is necessary than the benefits which I have enumerated to answer to the idea of a religion, whereas our national form professes to be little more than this, reading the Bible and living a correct life. It is not a religion of persons and things, of acts of faith, and of direct devotion, but of sacred scenes and pious sentiments. It has been comparatively careless of creed and catechism, and has in consequence shown little sense of the need of consistency in the matter of its teaching. Its doctrines are not so much facts as stereotyped aspects of facts, and it is afraid to say of walking around them. It induces its followers to be content with this meager view of revealed truth, or rather, it is suspicious and protests, or it is frightened as if it saw a figure in a picture move out of its frame, when our Lord, the Blessed Virgin, or the Holy Apostles are spoken of as real beings, and really such as Scripture implies them to be. I am not denying that assent which it inculcates, and elicits is genuine as regards its contracted range of doctrine, but it is at best notional. What Scripture especially illustrates from its first page to its last is God's providence, and that is nearly the only doctrine held with a real assent by the means of mass of religious Englishmen. Hence the Bible is so great a solace and refuge to them in trouble. I repeat, I am not speaking of particular schools and parties in England, whether of the high church or the low, but of the mass of piously minded and well-living people in all ranks of the community. Heading 3, Opinion. That class of assents which I have called credence, being a spontaneous acceptance of the various informations which are, by whatever means, conveyed to our minds, sometimes goes by the name of opinion. When we speak of a man's opinions, what do we mean? But the collection of notions which he happens to have and does not easily part with, though he has neither sufficient proof nor firm grasp of them. This is true, however. Opinion is a word of various significations, and I prefer to use it in my own. Besides standing for credence, it is sometimes taken to mean conviction, as when we speak of the variety of religious opinions, or of being persecuted for religious opinions, or of having no opinion on a particular point, or of another having no religious opinions, and sometimes it is used in contrast with conviction, and as synonymous with a light and casual, though genuine assent. Thus, if a man was every day changing his mind, that is, his assents, we might say that he was very changeable in his opinions. I shall here use the word to denote an assent, but an assent to a proposition not as true, but as probably true, that is, to the probability of that which the proposition enunciates, and as that probability may vary in strength without limit, so may the cogency and moment of the opinion. This account of opinion may seem to confuse it with inference, for the strength of an inference varies with its premises and is a probability, but the two acts of mind are really distinct. Opinion, as being an assent, is independent of premises. We have opinions which we never think of defending by argument, though of course we think they can be so defended. We are even obstinate in them, or what is called opinionated, and may say that we have a right to think just as we please, reason or no reason, whereas inference is in its nature and by its profession conditional and uncertain. To say that we shall have a fine hay harvest, if the present weather lasts, does not come of the same state of mind as I am of the opinion that we shall have a fine hay harvest this year. Opinion, thus explained, has more connection with credence than with inference. It differs from credence in these 2 points, viz., that while opinion explicitly assents to the probability of a given proposition, credence is an implicit assent to its truth. It differs from credence in a third respect, viz., in being a reflex act. When we take a thing for granted, we have credence in it. When we begin to reflect upon our credence, and to measure, estimate, and modify it, then we are forming an opinion. It is in this sense that Catholics speak of theological opinion, in contrast with faith and dogma. It is much more than an inferential act, but it is distinct from an act of certitude. And this is really the sense which Protestants give to the word when they interpret it by conviction. For their highest opinion in religion is, generally speaking, an assent to a probability, as even Butler has been understood or misunderstood to teach, and therefore consistent with toleration of its contradictory. Opinion being such, as I have described, is a notional assent, for the predicate of the proposition on which it is exercised is the abstract word probable. Fourth heading, presumption. By presumption I mean an assent to first principles, and by first principles I mean the propositions with which we start in reasoning on any given subject matter. They are in consequence very numerous, and vary in great measure with the persons who reason, according to their judgment and power of assent being received by some minds, not by others, and only a few of them received universally. They are all of them notions, not images, because they express what is abstract, not what is individual, and from direct experience. Sometimes our trust in our powers of reasoning and in memory, that is, our implicit assent to their telling truly, is treated as a first principle, but we cannot properly be said to have any trust in them as faculties. At most we trust in particular acts of memory and reasoning. We are sure there was a yesterday, and that we did this or that in it. We are sure that 3 times 6 is 18, and that the diagonal of a square is longer than the side. So far as this, we may be said to trust the mental act, by which the object of our assent is verified, but in doing so we imply no recognition of a general power or faculty, or of any capability or affection of our minds, over and above the particular act. We know indeed that we have a faculty by which we remember, as we know we have a faculty by which we breathe. But we gain this knowledge by abstraction or inference from its particular acts, not by direct experience. Nor do we trust in the faculty of memory or reasoning as such, even after we have inferred its existence, for its acts are often inaccurate, nor do we invariably assent to them. However, if I must speak my mind, I have another ground for reluctance to speak of our trusting memory or reasoning, except indeed by a figure of speech. It seems to me unphilosophical to speak of trusting ourselves. We are what we are, and we use not trust our faculties. To debate about trusting in a case like this is parallel to the confusion implied in wishing I had a choice if I would be created or no, and speculating what I should be like if I were born of other parents. Proximus sum ego mihi. Our consciousness of self is prior to all questions of trust or assent. We act according to our nature, by means of ourselves, when we remember or reason. We are as little able to accept or reject our mental constitution as our being. We have not the option, we can but misuse or mar its functions. We do not confront or bargain with ourselves, and therefore I cannot call the trustworthiness of the faculties of memory and reasoning one of our first principles. Next, as to the proposition that there are things existing and external to ourselves, this I do consider a first principle and one of universal reception. It is founded on an instinct, I so call it, because the brute creation possesses it. This instinct is directed toward individual phenomena, one by one, and has nothing of the character of generalization, and since it exists in brutes, the gift of reason is not a condition of its existence, and it may justly be considered an instinct in man also. What the human mind does is what brutes cannot do, viz. To draw from our ever-recurring experiences of its testimony and particulars in a general proposition, and because this instinct or intuition acts whenever the phenomena of sense present themselves, to lay down in broad terms, by an inductive process, the great aphorism that there is an external world, and that all the phenomena of sense proceed from it. This general proposition, to which we go on to assent, goes extensive, though not intensive, far beyond our experience, illimitable as that experience may be, and represents a notion. As I have spoken, and I think rightly spoken, of instinct as a force which spontaneously impels us, not only to bodily movements, but to mental acts. It is instinct which leads to the quasi-intelligent principle, whatever it is, in brutes to perceive in the phenomena of sense something distinct from and beyond those phenomena. It is instinct which impels the child to recognize in the smiles or the frowns of a countenance which meets its eyes, not only to be external to himself, but one whose looks elicit in him confidence or fear. And he instinctively interprets these physical phenomena as tokens of things beyond themselves. So from the sensations attendant upon certain classes of his thoughts and actions he gains a perception of an external being who reads his mind, to whom he is responsible, who praises and blames, who promises and threatens. As I am only illustrating a general view by examples, I shall take this analogy for granted here. And then we have our initial knowledge of the universe through sense. So do we, in the first instance, begin to learn about its Lord and God from conscience, and as from particular acts of that instinct, which makes experiences here mere images, as they ultimately are, upon the retina, the means of our perceiving something real beyond them. We go on to draw the general conclusion that there is a vast external world. So from the recurring instances in which conscience acts, forcing upon us importunately the mandate of a superior, we have fresh evidence of the existence of a sovereign ruler, from whom those particular dictates which we experience proceed, so that, with limitations which cannot be here made without digression from my main subject, we may, by means of that induction from particular experiences of conscience, have as good a warrant for concluding the ubiquitous presence of one supreme master as we have from parallel experience of sense for assenting to the fact of a multiform and vast world, material and mental. However, this assent is notional because we generalize a consistent, methodical form of divine unity and personality with its attributes from particular experiences of the religious instinct, which are themselves only intensive, not extensive, and in the imagination, not intellectually, notices of its presence, though at the same time that assent may become real, of course, as may the assent to the external world, viz., when we apply our general knowledge to a particular instance of that knowledge, as, according to a former remark, the general varium et mutabile was realized in Dido. And in thus treating the origin of these great notions, I am not forgetting the aid which from our earliest years we receive from teachers, nor am I denying the influence of certain original forms of thinking or formative ideas, connatural with our minds, without which we could not reason at all. I am only contemplating the mind as it moves in fact by whatever hidden mechanism, as a locomotive engine could not move without steam, but still under whatever number of forces it certainly does start from Birmingham and does arrive in London. And so, again, as regards the first principles expressed in such propositions as there is a right and a wrong, a true and a false, a just and an unjust, a beautiful and a deformed, they are abstractions to which we give a notional assent in consequence of our particular experiences of qualities in the concrete, to which we give a real assent, as we form our notion of whiteness from the actual sight of snow, milk, a lily, or a cloud, so after experiencing the sentiment of approbation which arises in us on the sight of certain acts one by one, we go on to assign to that sentiment a cause, and to those acts a quality, and we give to this notional cause or quality the name of virtue, which is an abstraction, not a thing. And in like manner, when we have been affected by a certain specific admiring pleasure at the sight of this or that concrete object, we proceed by an arbitrary act of the mind to give a name to the hypothetical cause or quality in the abstract which excites it. We speak of it as beautifulness, and henceforth when we call a thing beautiful, we mean by the word a certain quality of things which creates in us this special sensation. These so-called first principles, I say, are really conclusions or abstractions from particular experiences, and an assent to their existence is not an assent to things or their images, but to notions, real assent being confined to the propositions directly embodying those experiences. Such notions indeed are an evidence of the reality of the special sentiments in particular instances without which they would not have been formed, but in themselves they are abstractions from facts, not elementary truths prior to the reasoning. I am not, of course, dreaming of denying the objective existence of the moral law, nor our instinctive recognition of the immutable difference in the moral qualities of acts, as elicited in us by one instance of them. Even one act of cruelty, ingratitude, generosity, or justice reveals to us at once intensive, the immutable distinction between those qualities and their contraries. That is, in that particular instance, and pro hac vice. From such experience, and experience which is ever recurring, we proceed to abstract and generalize, and thus the abstract proposition, there is a right and a wrong, as representing an act of inference, is received by the mind with a notional, not a real assent. However, in proportion as we obey the particular dictates which are its tokens, so are we led on more and more to view it in the association of those particulars which are real, and virtually to change our notion of it into the image of that objective fact, which in each particular case it undeniably is. Another of these presumptions is the belief in causation. It is to me a perplexity that grave authors seem to enunciate as an intuitive truth that everything must have a cause. If this were so, the voice of nature would tell false, for why in that case stop short at one, who is himself without cause? The assent which we give to the proposition as a first principle has nothing happens without a cause is derived in the first instance from what we know of ourselves, and we argue analogically from what is within us to what is external to us. One of the first experiences of an infant is that of his willing and doing, and as time goes on, one of the first temptations of the boy is to bring home to himself the fact of his sovereign or arbitrary power, though it be at the price of waywardness, mischievousness, and disobedience. And when his parents, as antagonists to this willfulness, begin to restrain him and to bring his mind and conduct into shape, then he has a second series of experiences of cause and effect, and that upon a principle or rule. Thus the notion of causation is one of the first lessons which he learns from experience, that experience limiting it to agents possessed of intelligence and will. It is the notion of power combined with a purpose and an end. Physical phenomena, as such, are without cause, and experience teaches us nothing about physical phenomena as causes. Accordingly, wherever the world is young, the movements and changes of physical nature have been and are spontaneously ascribed by its people to the presence and will of hidden agents who haunt every part of it, the woods, the mountains, and the streams, the air, and the stars, for good or for evil, just as children again, by beating the ground after falling, imply that what has bruised them has intelligence, nor is there anything illogical in such a belief. It rests on the argument from analogy. As time goes on and society is formed and the idea of science is mastered, a different aspect of the physical universe presents itself to the mind, since causation implies a sequence of acts in our own case, and our doing is always posterior, never contemporaneous or prior to our willing. Therefore, when we witness invariable antecedents and consequence, we call the former the cause of the latter, though intelligence is absent from the analogy of external appearances. At length we go on to confuse causation with order, and because we happen to have made a successful analysis of some complicated assemblage of phenomena which experience has brought before us in the visible scene of things, and have reduced them to a tolerable dependence on each other, we call the ultimate point of this analysis and the hypothetical facts in which the whole mass of phenomena is gathered up by the name of causes, whereas they are really only the formula under which those phenomena are conveniently represented. Thus, the constitutional formula, "the king can do no wrong," is not a fact or a cause of the Constitution, but a happy mode of bringing out its genius, of determining the correlations of its elements, and of grouping or regulating political rules and proceedings in a particular direction and in a particular form. And in like manner, all that the particles of matter throughout the universe are in a like manner that all the particles of matter throughout the universe are attracted to each other with a force varying inversely with the square of their respective distances, is a profound idea harmonizing the physical works of the Creator. But even could it be proved to be a universal fact, and also to be the actual cause of the movements of all bodies in the universe, still it would not be an experience or any more than is the mythological doctrine of the presence of innumerable spirits in those same physical phenomena. Of these two senses of the word cause, viz., that which brings a thing to be, and that on which a thing under given circumstances follows. The former is that of which our experience is the earlier and more intimate, being suggested to us by our consciousness of willing and doing. The latter of the two requires a discrimination and exactness of thought for its apprehension, which implies special mental training. Else how do we learn to call food the cause of refreshment, but day never cause of the night, though night follows day more surely than refreshment follows food? Starting then from experience, I consider a cause to be an effective will, and by the doctrine of causation, I mean the notion, or first principle, that all things come of effective will, and the reception or presumption of this notion is a notional assent. As to causation, in the second sense, viz., an ordinary succession of antecedents and consequence, or what is called the order of nature, when so explained it falls under the doctrine of general laws, and of this I proceed to make mention. As another first principle or notion derived by us from experience, and accepted with what I have called a presumption, by natural law I mean the fact that things happen uniformly according to certain circumstances, and not without them and at random, that is, that they happen in an order, and as all things in the universe are unit and individual, order implies a certain repetition, whether of things or like things, or of their affections and relations. Thus we have experience, for instance, of the regularity of our physical functions, such as the beating of the pulse and the heaving of the breath, of the recurring sensations of hunger and thirst, of the alternation of waking and sleeping, and the succession of youth and age. In like manner we have experience of the great recurring phenomena of the heavens and earth, of day and night, summer and winter. Also we have experience of a like uniform succession in the instance of fire burning, water choking, stones falling down and not up, iron moving towards a magnet, friction followed by sparks and crackling, an oar load looking bent in the stream, and compressed steam bursting its vessel. Also by scientific analysis we are led to the conclusion that phenomena which seem very different from each other admit of being propped together as modes of the operation of one hypothetical law acting under varied circumstances. For instance, the motion of a stone falling freely, of a projectile, and of a planet may be generalized as one and the same property in each of them, of the particles of matter, and this generalization loses its character of hypothesis and becomes a probability in proportion as we have reason for thinking on other grounds that the particles of all matter really move and act towards each other in one certain way in relation to space and time, and not in half a dozen ways, that is, that nature acts by uniform laws. And thus we advanced to the general notion or first principle of the sovereignty of law throughout the universe. There are philosophers who go further and teach not only a general but an invariable and an inviolable and necessary uniformity in the action of the laws of nature, holding that everything is the result of some law or laws, and that exceptions are impossible. But I do not see on what ground of experience or reason they take up this position. Our experience rather is adverse to such a doctrine. For what concrete fact or phenomenon exactly repeats itself? Some abstract conception of it is more perfect than the recurrent phenomena itself. It is necessary before we are able to say that it has happened even twice, and the variations which accompany the repetition are of the nature of exceptions. The earth, for instance, never moves exactly in the same orbit year by year, but is in perpetual vacillation. It will indeed be replied that this arises from the interaction of one law with another, of which the actual orbit is only the accidental issue, that the earth is under the influence of a variety of attractions from cosmical bodies, and that of it is then, if it is subject to continual aberrations in its course, these are accounted for accurately or sufficiently by the presence of those extraordinary and invariable attractions. Science, then, by its analytical processes, sets right the prima facie confusion. Of course, still let us not by our words imply that we are appealing to experience, when we really are only accounting, and that by hypothesis, for the absence of experience. The confusion is a fact. The reasoning processes are not facts. The extraordinary attractions assigned to account for our experience of that confusion are not themselves experienced phenomenal facts, but more or less probable hypotheses argued out by means of an assumed analogy between the cosmical bodies to which those attractions are referred and falling bodies on the earth. I say assumed because that analogy, in other words, the unfailing uniformity of nature, is the very point which has to be proved. It is true that we can make experiment of the law of attraction in the case of bodies on the earth, but I repeat to assume from analogy that as stones do fall to the earth, so Jupiter, if let alone, would fall upon the earth, and the earth upon Jupiter, and with certain peculiarities of velocity on either side, is to have recourse to an explanation which is not necessarily valid, unless nature is necessarily uniform. Nor indeed has it yet been proved, nor ought it to be assumed, even that the law of velocity of falling bodies on the earth is invariable in its operation, for that again is only an instance of the general proposition, which is the very thesis in debate. It seems safer then to hold that the order of nature is not necessary, but general in its manifestations. But it may be urged, if a thing happens once, it must happen always, for what is to hinder it? Nay, on the contrary. Why? Because one particular particle of matter has a certain property, should all particles have the same. Why? Because particles have instanced the property 1,000 times, should the 1,001st instance it also. It is prima facie unaccountable that an accident should happen twice, not to speak of its happening always. If we expect a thing to happen twice, it is because we think it is not an accident, but has a cause. What has brought about a thing once may bring it about it twice. What is to hinder its happening? Rather, what is to make it happen? Here we are thrown back from the question of order to that of causation. A law is not a cause, but a fact. But when we come to the question of cause, then, as I have said, we have no experience of any cause but will. If, then, I must answer the question, what is to alter the order of nature? I reply, that which is willed it. That which willed it can unwill it, and the invariableness of law depends on the unchangeableness of that will. And here I am led to observe that as a cause implies a will, so order implies a purpose. Did we see flint celts in their various receptacles all over Europe, scored always with certain special and characteristic marks, even though those marks had no assigned meaning or final cause whatever? We should take that very repetition, which indeed is the principle of order, to be a proof of intelligence. The agency, then, which has kept up and keeps up the general laws of nature, energizing at once in Sirius and on the earth in its primary period, as well as in the 19th century, must be mind and nothing else, and mind at least as wide and enduring as in its living action as the immeasurable gauges and spaces of the universe on which that agency has left its traces. In these remarks I have digressed from my immediate subject, but they have some bearing on points which will subsequently come into discussion. Heading 5, Speculation. Speculation is one of those words which, in the vernacular, have so different a sense from what they bear in philosophy. It is commonly taken to mean a conjecture or a venture on chances, but its proper meaning is mental sight, or the contemplation of mental operations and their results as opposed to experience, experiment, or sense, analogous to its meaning in Shakespeare's line, "Thou hast no speculation in those eyes." In this sense I use it here, and I use it in this sense to denote those notional assents which are the most direct, explicit, and perfect of their kind, viz., those which are the firm, conscious acceptance of propositions as true. This kind of assent includes the assent to all reasoning and its conclusions, to all general propositions, to all rules of conduct, to all proverbs, aphorisms, sayings, and reflections on men and society. Of course, mathematical investigations and truths are the subjects of this speculative assent. So are legal judgments and constitutional maxims, as far as they appeal to us for assent. So are the determinations of science, so are the principles, disputations, and doctrines of theology, that there is a God, that he has certain attributes, and in what sense he can be said to have attributes, that he has done certain works, that he has made certain revelations of himself and of his will, and what they are, and the multiplied bearings of the parts of the teaching, thus developed and formed upon each other. All this is the subject of notional assent, and of that particular department of which I have called speculation. As far as these particular subjects can be viewed in the concrete and represent experiences, they can be received by real assent also, but as expressed in general propositions, they belong to notional apprehension and assent. Section 2, that was all. That previous section was Section 1, all notional assents under 5 headings. Section 2, real assents. This is still Chapter 4. I have in a measure anticipated the subject of real assent by what I have been saying about notional. In comparison of the directness and force of the apprehension which we have of an object, when our assent is to be called real, notional assent and inference seem to be thrown back into one and the same class of intellectual acts, though the former of the two is always an unconditional acceptance of the proposition, and the latter is an acceptance on the condition of an acceptance of its premises. In its notional sense, as well as in its inferences, the mind contemplates its own creations instead of things. In real, it is directed toward things, represented by the impressions which they have left on the imagination. These images, when assented to, have an influence both on the individual and on the society, which mere notions cannot exert. I have already given various illustrations of real assent. I will follow them up here by some instances of the change of notional assent into real. For instance, boys at school look at each other and pursue the same studies, some of them with greater success than others. But it will sometimes happen that those who acquitted themselves but poorly in class, when they come into the action of life, engage in some particular work, which they have already been learning in its theory, and with little promise of proficiency, are suddenly found to have what is called an eye for that work, an eye for trade matters, or for engineering, or for a special taste for literature, which no one expected from them at school, while they were engaged on notions. Minds of this stamp not only know the received rules of their profession, but enter into them, and even anticipate them, or dispense with them, or substitute other rules instead. And when new questions are opened, and arguments are drawn up on one side and the other in long array, they, with a natural ease and promptness, form their views and give their decision, as if they had no need to reason, from their clear apprehension of the lie and issue of the whole matter in dispute, as if it were drawn out in a map before them. These are the reformers, systematizers, inventors in various departments of thought, speculative and practical, in education, in administration, in social and political matters, in science. Such men are indeed far from infallible, however great their powers. They sometimes fall into great errors in their own special department, while the second-rate men who go by rule come to sound and safe conclusions. Images need not be true, but I am illustrating what vividness of apprehension is, and what is the strength of belief consequent upon it. Again, 20 years ago, the Duke of Wellington wrote his celebrated letter on the subject of the national defense. His authority gave it an immediate circulation among all classes of the community. None questioned what he said, nor as if taking his word on faith merely, but as intellectually recognizing their truth. Yet few could be said to see or feel that truth. His letter lay, so to say, upon the pure intellect of the national mind, and nothing for a time came of it. But 11 years afterwards, after his death, the anger of the French colonels with us, and after the attempt upon Louis Napoleon's life, transferred its facts to the charge of the imagination. Then forthwith the national assent became in various ways an operative principle, especially in its promotion of the volunteer movement. The Duke, having a special eye for military matters, had realized the state of things from the first, but it took a course of years to impress upon the public mind an assent to his warning deeper and more energetic than the reception it is accustomed to give to a clever article in a newspaper or a review. And so generally great truths, practical or ethical, float on the surface of society, admitted by all, valued by few, exemplifying the poet's adage, probitas laudatur et alget, until changed circumstances, accident, or the continual pressure of their advocates force them upon its attention. The iniquity, for instance, of the slave trade ought to have been acknowledged by all men from the first. It was acknowledged by many, but it needed an organized agitation, with tracts and speeches innumerable, so to affect the imagination of men as to make their acknowledgment of that iniquitous operative, the iniquitousness operative, to make their acknowledgement of that iniquitousness operative. In like manner, when Mr. Wilberforce, after succeeding in the slave question, urged the Duke of Wellington to use his great influence in discountenancing dueling, he could only get from him in answer, "A relic of barbarism, Mr. Wilberforce," as if he accepted a notion without realizing a fact. At length, the growing intelligence of the community and the shock inflicted upon it by the tragical circumstances of a particular duel were fatal to that barbarism. The governing classes were roused from their dreamy acquiescence in an abstract truth and recognized the duty of giving it practical expression. Let us consider, too, how different young and old are affected by the words of some classic author, such as Homer or Horace. Passages which to a boy are but rhetorical commonplaces, neither better nor worse than 100 others which any clever writer might supply, which he gets by heart and thinks very fine and imitates, as he thinks, successfully, in his own flowing versification, at length come home to him, when long years have passed, and he has had experience of life, and pierce him as if he had never before known them, with their sad earnestness and vivid exactness. Then he comes to understand how it is that lines, the birth of some chance morning or evening at an Ionian festival, or among the Sabine hills, have lasted generation after generation for thousands of years, with a power over the mind and a charm which the current literature of his own day, with all its obvious advantages, is utterly unable to rival. Perhaps this is the reason of the medieval opinion about Virgil, as if a prophet or a magician. His single words and phrases, his pathetic half-lines, giving utterance as the voice of nature itself to that pain and weariness, yet hope of better things, which is the experience of her children in every time. And what the experience of the world affects, for the illustration of classical authors, that office the religious sense, carefully cultivated, fulfills towards Holy Scripture. To the devout and spiritual, the divine word speaks of things, not merely of notions. And again, to the disconsolate, the tempted, the perplexed, the suffering, there comes by means of their very trials an enlargement of thought, which enables them to see in it what they never saw before. Henceforth, there is to them a reality in its teachings, which they recognize as an argument, and the best of arguments, for its divine origin. Hence, the practice of meditation on the sacred texts, so highly thought of by Catholics, reading as we do the Gospels from our youth up, we are in danger of becoming so familiar with them as to be dead to their force, and to view them as mere history. The purpose, then, of meditation is to realize them, to make the facts which they relate stand out before our minds as objects, such as may be appropriated by a faith as living as the imagination which apprehends them. It is obvious to refer to the unworthy use made of the more solemn parts of the sacred volume by the mere popular preacher. His very mode of reading, whether warnings or prayers, is as if he thought them to be little more than fine writing, poetical in a sense, musical in sound, and worthy of inspiration. The most awful truths are to him but sublime, beautiful conceptions, and are adduced and used by him in season and out of season for his own purposes, for embellishing his style or rounding out his periods. But let his heart at length be ploughed by some keen grief or deep anxiety, and Scripture is a new book to him. This is the change which so often takes place in what is called religious conversion, and it is a change so far simply for the better, by whatever infirmity or error it is in the particular case accompanied. And it is strikingly suggested to us to take a saintly example in the confession of the patriarch Job, when he contrasts his apprehension of the Almighty before and after his afflictions. He says he had indeed a true apprehension of the divine attributes before as well as after, but with the trial came a great change in the character of that apprehension. With the hearing of his ear, he says, I have heard thee. With the hearing of the ear, he says, I have heard thee, but now mine eye has seeth thee. Therefore I reprehend myself, and do penance in dust and ashes. Let these instances suffice of real assent, in its relation to notional. They lead me to make 3 marks in further illustration of its character. In fact, the fact of the distinctness of the images which are required for real assent is no warrant for the existence of the objects which those images represent. Our proposition, be it ever so keenly apprehended, may be true or may be false, if we simply put aside all inferential information, such as is derived from testimony, from general belief, from the concurrence of the senses, from common sense, or otherwise we have no right to consider that we have apprehended a truth merely because of the strength of our mental impression of it. Hence the proverb, fronti nulla fides. An image with the characters of perfect veracity and faithfulness may be ever so distinct and eloquent an object presented before the mind, or as it is sometimes called an objectum internum, or a subject object, but nevertheless there may be no external reality in the case corresponding to it, in spite of its impressiveness. One of the most remarkable instances of this fallacious impressiveness is the illusion which possesses the minds of able men, those especially who are exercised in physical investigations in favor of the inviolability of the laws of nature. Philosophers of the school of Hume discard the very supposition of miracles and scornfully refuse to hear evidence in their behalf in given instances, from their intimate experience of physical order and of the ever-recurring connection of antecedent and consequent. Their imagination usurps the functions of reason, and they cannot bring themselves even to entertain as a hypothesis, and this is all that they are asked to do, a thought contrary to that vivid impression of which they are the victims, that the uniformity of nature, which they witness hour by hour, is equivalent to a necessary inviolable law. Yet it is plain, and I shall take it for granted here, that when I assent to a proposition, I ought to have some more legitimate reason for doing so than the brilliancy of the image of which that proposition is the expression. That I have no experience of a thing happening except in one way is a cause of the intensity of my assent. If I assent, but not a reason for my assenting. In saying this, I am not disposed to deny the presence in some men of an idiosyncratic sagacity, which really and rightly sees reasons in impressions which common men cannot see, and is secured from the peril of confusing truth with make-belief. But this is genius and beyond rule. I grant too, of course, that accidentally impressiveness does, in matter of fact, as in the instance which I have been giving, constitute the motive principle of belief, for the mind is ever exposed to the danger of being carried away by the liveliness of its conceptions to the sacrifice of good sense and conscientious caution, and the more rare are its gifts, the greater is the risk of swerving from the line of reason and duty. But here I am not speaking of transgressions of rule any more than of exceptions to it, but of the normal constitution of our minds and of the natural rightful effect of acts of the imagination upon us, and this is not to create assent, but to intensify it. Next, assent, however strong and accorded to images, however vivid, is not therefore necessarily practical. Strictly speaking, it is not imagination that causes action, but hope and fear. Likes and dislikes, appetite, passion, affection, the stirrings of selfishness and self-love. What imagination does for us is to find a means of stimulating those motive powers, and it does so by providing a supply of objects strong enough to stimulate them. The thought of honor, glory, duty, self-aggrandizement, gain, or, on the other hand, of divine goodness, future, reward, eternal life, preservingly dwelt upon, leads us along a course of action corresponding to itself, but only in case that there be that in our minds which is congenial to it. However, when there is that preparation of mind, the thought does lead to the act. Hence, it is that the fact of a proposition being accepted with a real assent is accidentally an earnest of that proposition being carried out in conduct, and the imagination may be said, in some sense, to be of a practical nature, inasmuch as it leads to practice indirectly by the action of its object upon the affections. There is a third remark suggested by the view which I have been taking of real assents, viz., that they are of a personal character, each individual having his own and being known by them. It is otherwise with notions. Notional apprehension is in itself an ordinary act of our common nature. All of us have the power of abstraction, and can be taught either to make or to enter into the same abstractions, and thus to cooperate in the establishment of a common measure between mind and mind. And though for one and all of us to assent to the notions which we thus apprehend in common is a further step as requiring the adoption of a common standpoint of principle and judgment, yet this too depends in good measure on certain logical processes of thought with which we are all familiar, and on facts which we all take for granted, but we cannot make sure for ourselves or for others of real apprehension as an assent, because we have to secure first the images which are their objects, and these are often peculiar and special. They depend on personal experience, and the experience of one man is not the experience of another. Real assent, then, is as the experience which it presupposes is proper to the individual, and as such thwarts rather than promotes the intercourse of man with man. It shuts itself up, as it were, in its own home, or at least in its own witness, and in its own standard, and as in the instances above given, it cannot be reckoned on, anticipated, accounted for, inasmuch as it is the accident of this man or that. I call the characteristics of an individual accidents in spite of the universal reign of law, because they are severally the coincidence of many laws, and there are no laws as yet discovered of such coincidence. A man who is run over in the street and killed, in one sense suffers according to the rule of law. He was crossing, he was short-sighted or preoccupied in mind, or he was looking another way, he was deaf, lame, or flurried, and the cab came up at a great pace. If all this was so, it was by a necessity that he was run over. It would have been a miracle if he had escaped. So far is clear, but what is not clear is how all these various conditions met together in the particular case, how it was that a man, short-sighted, hard of hearing, deficient in presence of mind, happened to get in the way of a cab hurrying along to catch the train. This concrete fact does not come under any law of sudden deaths, but like the earth's yearly path, which I spoke up above, is the accident of the individual. It does not meet the case to refer to the law of averages, for such laws deal with percentages, not with individuals, and it is about individuals that I am speaking. That this particular man, out of the 3 millions congregated in the metropolis, was to have the experience of this catastrophe, and to be the select victim to appease that law of averages, no statistical tables could foretell, even though they could determine that it was in the fates that in that week or day some 4 persons in the length and breadth of London should be run over, and in like manner that this or that person should have the particular experience necessary for real assent on any point, that the deist should become a theist, that the Erastian a Catholic, the protectionist a free trader, the conservative a legitimist, the high Tory and out-and-out Democrat are facts each of which may be the result of a multitude of coincidences in one and the same individual, coincidences which we have no means of determining, and which therefore we may call accidents. For there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. Such accidents are the characteristics of persons as differentia, and properties are the characteristics of species or natures. That a man dies when deprived of air is not an accident of his person, but a law of his nature. That he cannot live without quinine or opium, or out of the climate of Madeira, is his own peculiarity. If all men everywhere usually had the yellow fever once in their lives, we should call it, speaking according to our knowledge, a law of the human constitution. If the inhabitants of a particular country commonly had it, we should call it the law of that climate. If a healthy man has a fever in a healthy place, in a healthy season, we call it an accident, though it be reducible to the coincidence of the law of laws, because there is no known law of their coincidence. To be rational, to have speech, to pass through successive changes of mind and body from infancy to death, belong to man's nature. To have a particular history, to be married or single, to have children or be childless, to live a given number of years, to have certain constitution, and again, moral temperament, intellectual outfit, mental formation, these and the like taken all together are the accidents which make up our notion of a man's person, and are the groundwork or condition of his particular experiences. Moreover, various of the experiences which befall this man may be the same as those which befall that, although those experiences result each from the combination of his own accidents and are ultimately traceable, each to its own special condition or history, that is, images which are possessed in common with their apprehensions and assents, may nevertheless be personal characteristics. If 200 or 300 men are to be found who cannot live out of Madeira, that inability would be an accident and a peculiarity of each of them. Even if in each case it implied delicacy of lungs, still that delicacy is a vague notion, comprehending it under it a great variety of cases in detail. If 500 brethren at once saw our risen Lord, that common experience would not be a law, but a personal accident which was the prerogative of each. And so again, in this day, the belief of so many thousands in his divinity is not therefore notional, because it is common, but may be a real and personal belief, being produced in different individual minds by various experiences and disposing causes variously combined, such as a warm or a strong imagination, great sensibility, compunction, and horror at sin, frequenting the Mass and other rites of the Church, meditating on the contents of the Gospel, familiarity with hymns and religious poems, dwelling on the evidences, parental example and instruction, religious friends, strange providences, powerful preaching. In each case, the image and the mind, with the experiences out of which it is formed, would be a personal result, and though the same in all, would in each case be so idiosyncratic in its circumstances that it would stand by itself, a special formation, unconnected with any law, though at the same time it would necessarily be a principle of sympathy and a bond of intercourse between those whose minds had been thus variously wrought into a common assent, far stronger than could follow upon any multitude of mere notions which they unanimously held. And even when that assent is not the result of concurrent causes, if such a case is possible, but has the one single origin, as the study of Scripture, careful teaching, or a religious temper, still its presence argues a special history and a personal formation which an abstraction does not. For an abstraction can be made at will, and may be the work of a moment, but the moral experiences which perpetuate themselves in images must be sought after in order to be found. and encouraged and cultivated in order to be appropriated. I have now said all that occurs to me on the subject of real assents, perhaps not without some risk of subtlety and minuteness. They are sometimes called beliefs, convictions, certitudes, and as given to moral objects, they are perhaps as rare as they are powerful. Till we have them, in spite of a full apprehension and assent in the field of notions, we have no intellectual moorings, and are at the mercy of impulses, fancies, and wandering lights, whether as regards personal conduct, social and political action, or religion. These beliefs, be they true or false in the particular case, form the mind out of which they grow, and impart to it a seriousness and manliness which inspires in other minds confidence in its views, and is one secret of persuasiveness and influence in the public stage of the world. They create, as the case may be, heroes and saints, great leaders, statesmen, preachers, and reformers, the pioneers of discovery in science, visionaries, fanatics, knight-errants, demagogues, and adventurers. They have given to the world men of one idea, of immense energy, of adamantine will, of revolutionary power. They kindle sympathies between man, and knit together the innumerable units which constitute a race and a nation. They become the principle of its political existence. They impart to its homogeneity of thought and fellowship of purpose. They have given form to the medieval theocracy and to the Mohammedan superstition. They are now the life both of Holy Russia and of that freedom of speech and action which is the special boast of Englishmen. Section 3. Notional and real assents contrasted. It appears from what has been said that the real assent is not intrinsically operative. It accidentally and indirectly affects practice. It is in itself an intellectual act, of which the object is presented to it by the imagination, and though the pure intellect does not lead to action, nor the imagination either, yet the imagination has the means, which pure intellect has not, of stimulating those powers of the mind from which action proceeds. Real assent, then, or belief, as it may be called, viewed in itself, that is, simply as assent, does not lead to action, but the images in which it lives, representing as they do the concrete, have the power of the concrete upon the affections and passions, and by means of these indirectly become operative. Still, this practical influence is not invariable, nor to be relied on, for given images may have no tendency to affect given minds, or to excite them to action. Thus a philosopher or a poet may vividly realize the brilliant rewards of a military genius or of eloquence, without wishing either to be a commander or an orator. However, on the whole, broadly contrasting belief with notional assent and inference, and with inference, we shall not with this explanation be very wrong in pronouncing that acts of notional assent and of inference do not affect our conduct, and acts of belief, that is, of real assent, do, not necessarily, but do affect it. I have scarcely spoken of inference since my introductory chapter, though I intend before I conclude to consider it fully. But I have said enough to admit of my introducing it here in contrast with real assent or belief, and that contrast is necessary in order to complete what I have been saying about the latter. Let me then, for the sake of the latter, be allowed here to repeat that while assent or belief presupposes some apprehension of the things believed, inference requires no apprehension of the things inferred, that in consequence inference is necessarily concerned with surfaces and aspects, that it begins with itself and ends with itself, that it does not reach as far as facts, that it is employed upon formulas, that as far as it takes real objects or whatever kind into account, such as motives and actions, character and conduct, art, science, taste, morals, religion, it deals with them, not as they are, but simply in its own line, as materials of argument or inquiry, that they are to it nothing more than major and minor premises and conclusions. Belief, on the other hand, being concerned with things concrete, not abstract, which variously excite the mind from their moral and imaginative properties, has for its object, not only directly, what is true, but inconclusively what is beautiful, useful, admirable, heroic, objects which kindle devotion, rouse the passions, and attach the affections, and thus it leads the way to actions of every kind, to the establishment of principles and the formulation of character, and is thus again intimately connected with what is individual and personal. I insisted on this marked distinction between beliefs on the one hand and notional assents and inferences on the other many years ago in words which it will be to my purpose to use now. I quote them because, over and above their oppositeness in this place, they present the doctrine on which I have been insisting from a point of view and with a freshness and force which I cannot now command, and moreover, though they are my own, nevertheless, from the length of time which has elapsed since their publication, almost with the cogency of an independent testimony. They occur in a protest which I had occasion to write in February 1841 against a dangerous doctrine maintained, as I considered, by two very eminent men of that day, now no more, Lord Brougham and Sir Robert Peel. The doctrine was to the effect that the claims of religion could be secured and sustained in the mass of men, and in particular in the lower classes of society, by acquaintance with literature and physical science, and through the instrumentality of mechanics institutes and reading rooms, to the serious disparagement, as it seemed to me, of direct Christian instruction. In the course of my remarks is found the passage which I shall here quote, and which, with whatever differences in terminology and hardihood of assertion, befitting the circumstances of its publication, nay, as far as words go, an accuracy of theological statement, suitably illustrates the subject here under discussion. It runs thus. People say to me that it is but a dream to suppose that Christianity should regain the organic power in human society it once possessed. I cannot help that I never said it could. I am not a politician. I am proposing no measures, but exposing a fallacy and resisting a pretense. Let Benthamism reign, if men have no aspirations, but do not tell them to be romantic, and then solace them with glory. Do not attempt by philosophy what was once done by religion. The ascendancy of faith may be impractical, but the reign of knowledge is incomprehensible. The problem for statesmen of this age is how to educate the masses, and literature and science cannot give the solution. Science gives us the grounds or premises from which religious truths are to be inferred, but it does not set about inferring them, much less does it reach the inference. That is not its province. It brings before us phenomena, and it leaves us, if we will, to call them works of design, wisdom, or benevolence, and further still, if we will, to proceed to confess an intelligent Creator. We have to take its facts and to give them a meaning, and to draw out our own conclusions from them. First comes knowledge, then a view, then reasoning, and then belief. This is why science has so little of a religious tendency. Deductions have no power of persuasion. The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion. A conclusion is but an opinion. It is not a thing which is, but which we are quite sure about. Not what it is, but something we are quite sure about. And it has often been observed that we never say we are sure and certain without implying that we doubt. To say that a thing must be is to admit that it may not be. No one, I say, will die for his own calculations. He dies for realities. That is why a literary religion is so little to be depended upon. It looks well in fair weather, but its doctrines are opinions, and when called to suffer for them, it slips them between its folios, or burns them at its hearth. And this, again, is the secret of the distrust and raillery with which moralists have been so commonly visited. They say and do not. They say and do not. Why? Because they are contemplating the fitness of things, and they live by the square, when they should be realizing their high maxims in the concrete. Now, Sir Robert Peel thinks better of natural history, chemistry, and astronomy than of such ethics. But these two, what are they more than divinity in posse? He protests against controversial divinity. Is inferential much better? I have no confidence, then, in philosophers who cannot help being religious, and are Christians by implication. They sit at home and reach forward to distances which astonish us, but they hit without grasping. They are sometimes as confident about shadows as about realities. They have worked out by a calculation the lie of a country, which they never saw, and mapped it by means of a gazetteer. And like blind men, though they can put a stranger on his way, they cannot walk straight themselves, and do not feel it quite their business to walk at all. Logic makes but a sorry rhetoric with the multitude. For shoot round corners, and you may not despair of converting by a syllogism. Tell men to gain notions of a creator from his works, and if they were to set about it, which nobody does, they would be jaded and wearied by the labyrinth they were tracing. Their minds would be gorged and surfeited by the logical operation. Logicians are more set upon concluding rightly than on right conclusions. They cannot see the end for the process, for men have that power of mind which may hold fast and firmly to a variety of thoughts. We ridicule men of one idea, but a great many of us are born to be such, and we should be happier if we knew it. To most men, argument makes the point in hand only more doubtful and considerably less impressive. After all, man is not a reasoning animal. He is a seeing, feeling, contemplating, acting animal. He is influenced by what is direct and precise. It is very well to freshen our impressions and convictions from physics, but to create them we must go elsewhere. Sir Robert Peel never can think it possible that a mind can be so constituted that after being familiarized with the wonderful discoveries which have been made in every part of experimental science, it can retire from such contemplations without more enlarged conceptions of God's providence and a higher reverence for his name. If he speaks of religious mind, it perpetrates a truism. If of irreligious, he insinuates a paradox. Life is not long enough for a religion of inferences. We shall never have done beginning. If we be determined to begin with proof, we shall... that wasn't read well. Life is not long enough for a religion of inferences. We shall not have never done beginning if we determine to begin with proof. We shall ever be laying our foundations. We shall turn theology into evidences and divines into textuaries. We shall never get at our first principles. Resolve to believe nothing, and you must prove your proofs and analyze your elements, sinking farther and farther and finding in the lowest depths a lower deep, till you come to the broad bosom of skepticism. I would rather be bound to defend the reasonableness of assuming that Christianity is true than to demonstrate a moral governance from the physical world. Life is for action. If we insist on proofs for everything, we shall never come to action. If to act, you must assume, and that assumption is faith. Let no one suppose that in saying this I am maintaining that all proofs are equally difficult, and all propositions equally debatable. Some assumptions are greater than others, and some doctrines involve postulates larger than others, and more numerous. I only say that impressions lead to action, and that reasonings lead from it. Knowledge of premises and inferences upon them, this is not to live. It is very well as our matter of liberal curiosity and of philosophy to analyze our modes of thought, but let this come second, and when there is leisure for it, and then our examinations will be in many ways even be subservient to action. But if we can commence with the scientific knowledge and argumentative proof, or lay any great stress upon it as the basis of personal Christianity, or attempt to make man moral and religious by libraries and museums, let us, in consistency, take chemists for our cooks and mineralogists for our masons. Now I wish to state all this as a matter of fact, to be judged by the candid testimony of any persons whatever, why we are constituted that faith, not knowledge or argument, is our principle of action, is a question with which I have nothing to do, but I think it is a fact, and if it be such, we must resign ourselves to it as best we may, unless we take refuge in the intolerable paradox that the mass of men are created for nothing, and that are meant to leave life as they entered it. So well has this practically been understood in all ages of the world that no religion yet has been a religion of physics or of philosophy. It has ever been synonymous with revelation. It never has been a deduction from what we know. It has ever been an assertion of what we are to believe. It has never lived in a conclusion. It has ever been a message, a history, or a vision. No legislator or priest ever dreamed of educating our moral nature by science or by argument. There is no difference here between true religion and pretended. Moses was instructed not to reason from the creation, but to work miracles. Christianity is a higher, supernatural, and almost scenic. Christianity is a history supernatural and almost scenic. It tells us what its author is by telling us what he has done. Lord Brougham himself has recognized the force of this principle. He has not left his philosophical religion to argument. He has committed it to the keeping of the imagination. Why should he depict a great republic of letters and an intellectual pantheon, except that he feels that instances and patterns, not logical reasonings, are the living conclusions which alone have a hold over the affections or can form the character?